Before Central Park became a green refuge in the middle of New York City, it was only a rough and uncertain stretch of land, a place of rock, mud, scattered homes, uneven ground, and restless possibility. And before Frederick Law Olmsted became the man who helped transform that wild piece of Manhattan into one of the most beloved parks in the world, he was not yet an architect, not yet a designer, and not yet a famous name. He was a restless young man searching for a purpose. He tried one path, then another. He looked toward the sea. He worked with the soil. He traveled through unfamiliar places. He observed people, cities, farms, roads, and public spaces with a quiet but unusually attentive eye. Long before he learned how to shape landscapes, he was learning how to read them, and perhaps that is what made him different. Olmsted did not simply see land as decoration. He saw it as something human beings needed. He saw trees, winding paths, open meadows, and quiet water, not as luxuries but as a kind of medicine for crowded lives. In a century when American cities were growing louder, denser, and more exhausting, he began to imagine places where ordinary people could breathe again. Tonight, we follow his quiet and wandering life. We begin in Hartford, Connecticut, where a child with uncertain eyesight learned to notice the world slowly. We follow him through years of searching, across oceans, farms, cities, and country roads. We walk with him through England, where the idea of a public park began to take root in his mind. We travel with him through the American South, where he observed the painful divisions of a nation. And finally, we arrive in New York, where a rough piece of Manhattan would become the landscape that changed his life forever. But this is not only the story of Central Park, it is the story of a man who believed that beauty could serve the public good. A man who understood that a city was not complete unless it gave its people room to wander, rest, and feel human again. A man whose work would quietly spread beyond New York, shaping parks, parkways, campuses, neighborhoods, and green systems across America. So settle in gently. Let the noise of the present day begin to soften around you. Imagine the city at night, its streets gradually fading into the distance, its lamps glowing softly through the dark, its restless movements slowing beneath a wide and quiet sky. Somewhere beyond the stone and brick, beyond the carriages, footsteps, windows, and smoke, there is an open field waiting to be imagined. There is grass where there was once mud. There are trees where there was once bare rock. There are winding paths where tired people will one day walk in peace. And at the beginning of that long, quiet transformation stands Frederick Law Olmsted, not yet certain of who he is, not yet aware of what he will become, but already carrying within him the strange and beautiful idea that cities too need places to dream. Tonight we begin there, not with the finished park, not with the famous name, but with a restless young life slowly moving toward its purpose. Frederick Law Olmsted was born in Hartford, Connecticut on April 26, 1822, long before anyone could have imagined that his name would one day be connected to the green heart of New York City. Hartford in those years was not the enormous, restless world of stone and smoke that New York would later become in his imagination. It was smaller, quieter, and still closely tied to the rhythms of river, field, church bell, and road. The Connecticut River moved through the region with a slow and steady presence, and beyond the houses and shops of the town, the land opened into farms, wooded edges, gentle hills, and country paths where the air felt wider and more forgiving. He was born into a comfortable family. His father, John Olmsted, was a successful merchant, a man with enough stability to offer his children security, but also with a lively interest in travel, scenery, people, and places. Frederick's mother, Charlotte, belonged to the early warmth of his childhood, but that warmth did not remain for long. She died when Frederick was still very young, before he had even reached his 4th birthday. And so one of the first great facts of his life was absence. Not the kind of absence that announces itself loudly, but the quieter kind. The kind that settles into a house, into memory, into the spaces between ordinary days. Frederick was too young to fully understand what had been taken from him, but a child does not need complete understanding in order to feel change. The rooms are different, the voices are different. The pattern of care shifts around him. A year later, his father remarried. Mary Ann Bull entered the household, bringing a new form of order and care into the family. Life continued as it always does. Meals were prepared. Doors opened and closed. Seasons changed. The boy grew older beneath the steady roof of Hartford life. But even from childhood, Frederick did not seem destined for one straight road. There are some people whose early years look like a clear path drawn on the map. School, college, profession, reputation, one step following neatly after another. Olmsted's life was not like that. His education was irregular, interrupted, and scattered across different schools, tutors, and experiences. He was not formed only by classrooms. In some ways, he was formed more deeply by movement, by rides through the countryside, by changing light on trees, by the shape of roads, by the quiet drama of open land. While other boys were being prepared for a direct professional future, Frederick was slowly becoming a watcher of the world. And this is important to understand. The boy who would one day design parks did not begin by designing anything. He began by noticing. He noticed how a road curved through a landscape. He noticed how a field could make the body feel calmer simply by opening before the eye. He noticed how trees gathered shadow in summer, how distant hills softened the edge of the sky, how a person's mood could change when they stepped away from close rooms and into moving air. There was nothing famous in these observations. No one watching the young Frederick wandering through the countryside would have said, "This child is learning the language of landscape." But quietly, without title or plan, that is what was happening. His father's love of nature and travel helped shape him. John Olmsted often took an interest in scenery and places, and that interest seems to have passed into his son like a slow inheritance. Not an inheritance of money or property, though those things would matter too, but something more subtle, the belief that places had character, that land could be read, that a view could affect the heart. Frederick was not always a strong student in the ordinary sense. He was intelligent, curious, and sensitive to the world around him, but he did not fit easily into a rigid educational pattern. For a time, he attended Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, and studied surveying. Surveying was a practical art, full of measurement, distance, line, and terrain. It taught a person to look carefully at land, not as a vague background, but as something shaped by slope, boundary, elevation, and use. Yet even this path did not remain steady. When the teacher he studied with left, Frederick's time there came to an end as well. Once again, the road shifted. Once again, the future refused to become simple. Then came the trouble with his eyes. As he approached the age when a young man of his background might have prepared for Yale, a severe reaction to sumac poisoning weakened his eyesight. The exact experience must have been frightening in a quiet and private way. For a young person standing at the edge of adulthood, vision is more than the ability to see clearly. It is also a symbol of the future. To have the eyes weakened was to have the planned road blur before him. Yale had seemed possible. Then it was not. The classical path, the respectable path, the path that might have given him a clean and recognizable identity, began to fade. He would not simply step from school into college, from college into a profession, from profession into success. His life would move more slowly and strangely than that. But sometimes what appears to be a delay is really a different kind of education. Unable to follow the expected route, Frederick spent more time outside the strict walls of formal schooling. He read, he wandered, he observed. He absorbed the world through experience rather than through a single institution. His mind became restless, but not empty. It was gathering impressions, quietly and continuously. And because his eyesight had become uncertain, his way of seeing may have become more deliberate. He could not take the world for granted. He had to look with care. He had to rest his eyes, shift his attention, move between detail and atmosphere. Perhaps this helped shape the unusual sensitivity that would later define his work, the ability to think not only about what a place looked like, but what it did to the people moving through it. For Olmsted, landscape would never become mere decoration. It would become experience. A park was not just a collection of trees. A road was not just a way to move from one point to another. A field was not just empty land. These things carried feeling. They could soothe, open, guide, conceal, reveal, and restore. But all of that was still far in the future. For now, he was only a boy in Connecticut, growing up in a household touched by loss, surrounded by the quiet security of a prosperous father, shaped by an education that would not hold still. He was not yet the man of Central Park. He was not yet the writer, the farmer, the traveler, the public servant, or the designer of green places. He was simply Frederick. A child with uncertain eyes. A child who could not yet see his own future clearly. A child who, without knowing it, was already learning to understand the relationship between human beings and the open air. And as the years passed in Hartford, the world around him kept offering its quiet lessons. The river moved. The roads stretched outward. The fields changed color beneath the seasons. The trees gathered and released their leaves. The sky opened above the town again and again, wide, patient, and blue. Somewhere inside that restless young mind, the first seeds were beginning to settle. Not yet a plan, not yet a profession, only a feeling that life was larger outside, that people needed space, and that the shape of the land could gently shape the soul. As Frederick grew older, the quiet fields and river roads of Connecticut remained close to him, but they could not hold him completely. There was a restlessness in him that did not feel violent or rebellious. It was quieter than that. It was the restlessness of a young man who had not yet found the shape of his own life. He was not lazy. He was not without intelligence. He was not without ambition. But the ordinary path had blurred before him, and every road he tried seemed, after a time, to turn into another question. He had not gone to Yale. He had not settled into one clean profession. He had not yet become the man history would remember. Instead, Frederick Law Olmsted entered adulthood like someone walking through a landscape at dawn, when the outlines of things are visible but not yet fully clear. For a time he moved toward commerce. It was a sensible direction for a young man from a stable family, especially the son of a successful merchant. There were offices, ledgers, goods arriving and departing, practical matters to learn, and the steady rhythm of business. But the life of a merchant's clerk did not answer the deeper restlessness inside him. The work may have offered structure, but it did not offer horizon. Frederick's eyes, which had already troubled him, now seemed drawn beyond the walls of any counting room, beyond the desks and papers, beyond the controlled interior spaces of trade. There were ships in the harbor. There were masts rising against the sky. There were men unloading cargo from faraway places. There was the smell of salt, rope, tar, damp wood, and open distance. And so, like many young men who feel that life must be found somewhere beyond the familiar, he turned toward the sea. The sea promised movement. It promised distance. It promised a life wider than the one he had known. Olmsted joined a voyage connected to the China trade, stepping into a world that was nothing like the quiet roads of Hartford. The sea was not gentle in the way a meadow was gentle. It was vast, unstable, and indifferent. Days could be long and physically exhausting. The ship moved through water and weather with a rhythm that did not care about comfort. The body had to adjust to labor, sickness, salt air, and confinement. For a young man searching for romance and purpose, the sea may have first appeared as a doorway into the great world. But experience has a way of removing the mist from an idea. The imagined life of travel became the actual life of work. The open ocean, so beautiful from a distance, could also be harsh, repetitive, and lonely. Still, the voyage was not wasted. Olmsted learned something there. He learned that not every beautiful distance becomes a home. He learned that restlessness alone is not a calling. He learned that movement can carry a person far away without necessarily carrying him closer to himself. And when he returned, he was still searching. This is one of the most important truths about Frederick Law Olmsted's early life. He did not arrive quickly at his purpose. He did not step into the world already certain that he would design parks, shape cities, or help invent a profession. His genius did not appear first as a title. It appeared as attention. He kept trying. He kept observing. He kept gathering pieces of the world. After the sea, he turned toward the land. Farming offered a different kind of promise. Where the sea was unstable, the farm seemed grounded. Where ships moved constantly, fields stayed in place. There was soil to improve, trees to plant, fences to mend, crops to study, and seasons to understand. Farming required patience, and patience was one of the quiet lessons that would follow Olmsted for the rest of his life. He became interested in agriculture not merely as routine labor, but as a serious, thoughtful practice. The land was not just land, It had habits. It had needs. It answered differently depending on the soil, the drainage, the slope, the weather, and the care given to it. In this, perhaps, farming gave him another part of his later vision. A landscape could not be forced into beauty by decoration alone. It had to be understood. It had to be worked with. Water needed to move somewhere. Paths needed to follow the body naturally. Plants needed to belong to the ground they occupied. A place could appear effortless only when someone had thought deeply about its hidden structure. At the time, Frederick did not yet have those words. He was simply trying to farm. He worked with soil, tools, livestock, weather, and the slow uncertainty of crops. Eventually, with help from his father, he settled on a farm on Staten Island, a place that gave him both labor and space. There, with the lower waters of New York Harbor not far away, he lived between two worlds, rural and urban, quiet and restless, field and city. From Staten Island, New York was close enough to be felt. The city was growing, pressing outward, filling itself with movement and ambition. But on the farm, life still followed older rhythms: morning light, damp earth, the weight of tools in the hand, the long patience of planting, the careful observation of what thrives and what fails. Olmsted was not yet a designer of public parks, but he was already learning how land behaves. He was learning that open space is not empty. A field has structure. A line of trees has influence. A road changes how a person experiences distance. A view can pull the mind forward. A shaded path can slow the body without commanding it to stop. These quiet lessons would one day become part of a much larger language. But for now, they were only fragments, gathered slowly by a young man still uncertain of himself. He was a farmer, but not only a farmer. He was a traveler, but not only a traveler. He was a reader, a watcher, a worker, a man trying to understand where his abilities belonged. And because he had not been locked into one profession too early, he was being shaped by many kinds of experience at once. The sea had taught him scale. Commerce had shown him the movement of cities and trade. Farming taught him patience, drainage, growth, labor, and the hidden intelligence of land. His irregular education had taught him to learn outside of fixed institutions. His uncertain eyesight had perhaps taught him to look slowly, and his restless nature kept him moving from one lesson to the next. There is a quiet comfort in this part of his story, especially for anyone who has ever felt late, uncertain, or unfinished. Olmsted's life reminds us that purpose does not always arrive early. Sometimes a person must try many lives before discovering the one that was quietly forming underneath them all along. He was not born as the designer of Central Park. He became that man slowly, through failed plans, through interrupted schooling, through work that did not satisfy him, through journeys that tired him, through fields that demanded patience, through cities that made him wonder what human beings needed in order to live well together. And as he moved through these unsettled years, the question at the center of his life began to change. It was no longer simply, what should I become? It was becoming something deeper. What kind of places help people become more fully human? He did not yet know that this question would guide him toward public parks. He did not yet know that a future stretch of Manhattan rock and mud would one day require everything he had learned from wandering, farming, writing, and watching. But the preparation had already begun. Quietly, without ceremony, in the salt air of the harbor, in the slow labor of the farm, in the uneasy heart of a young man who could not stay still, because somewhere ahead of him, though he could not yet see it clearly, there was a landscape waiting for his restless mind to understand it. For a while, the farm on Staten Island gave Frederick Law Olmsted something close to steadiness. There was land beneath his feet, work for his hands, and a slow rhythm to the days. Morning light moved across the fields. The soil changed beneath the seasons. The harbor winds carried the distant breath of New York, reminding him that the city was always nearby, always growing, always pressing outward. But Olmsted was still not a man who could remain completely still. Even when he worked the land, some part of him kept looking beyond the fence line. He wanted to understand more than his own farm, more than his own country road, more than his own uncertain future. He wanted to see how other people lived, how other societies shaped their towns, their fields, their public places, and their daily habits. So, in 1850, He crossed the Atlantic and traveled to England. The voyage carried him away from the familiar shores of America and into an older landscape, one layered with centuries of roads, hedgerows, villages, estates, gardens, industrial towns, and crowded streets. England was not simply a place for him to visit. It became a book he could walk through slowly, page by page, field by field, city by city. He moved as he had always learned best, not from one formal lesson to another, but through direct experience. He walked, he looked, he listened, he noticed. He passed through countryside where green hedges divided the land into quiet patterns, where old trees leaned over narrow lanes, and where distant church towers rose gently through misty morning air. He saw villages shaped by long habit, farmhouses settled into their fields, and footpaths worn by generations of ordinary use. There was a softness to parts of the English countryside that spoke to him deeply, not because it was wild exactly, but because it seemed to hold human life and natural beauty in a careful balance. Yet England also showed him something harsher. The 19th century was not only a time of green fields and peaceful lanes, it was a time of factories, smoke, crowded housing, narrow streets, and industrial exhaustion. In the growing towns, people lived close together, often with little relief from noise, labor, and poor air. The modern world was gathering speed, and with that speed came pressure on the body and mind. Olmsted saw this contrast clearly. On one side, the old rural landscape offered calm, distance, shade, and air. On the other, the industrial city pressed people into brick, smoke, and repetition. And somewhere between those two worlds, a question began to form more clearly inside him. What if the healing qualities of the countryside did not have to belong only to the wealthy? What if ordinary people, tired from work and crowded streets, could also have access to trees, grass, open water, and winding paths? What if a public landscape could become a quiet form of justice? This question followed him as he traveled, but it became most powerful when he reached Birkenhead Park near Liverpool. Birkenhead Park was unlike anything he had truly known in America. It was not a private estate reserved for one family. It was not a decorative garden hidden behind wealth. It was a public park, a place created with the idea that ordinary citizens could enter, walk, rest, and enjoy the beauty of designed nature. It had lakes, open lawns, curving paths, trees, bridges, and carefully shaped views. But its deeper importance was not only in how it looked. Its deeper importance was in who it was for. As Olmsted walked through Birkenhead Park, he saw something that seemed both simple and revolutionary. He saw families moving through open air. He saw workers and children sharing scenery that, in another age, might have belonged only to aristocrats. He saw a landscape designed not merely to impress, but to restore. The paths did not rush a person forward. They curved gently, inviting the body to slow down. The water caught the light and held it quietly. Trees framed views without closing them. Lawns opened like green rooms beneath the sky. The whole place seemed to say that rest was not a privilege for the few, but a need shared by everyone. For Olmsted, this was more than beauty. It was a social idea made visible. A park could be a place where class softened, where strangers walked the same paths, where the crowded mind could loosen, where the city could remember that its people were not machines. It could offer dignity without demanding wealth. It could provide peace without requiring escape into private ownership. This thought settled into him deeply. He had seen farms before. He had seen cities before. He had seen private landscapes and rural roads. But here, in Birkenhead, he saw the possibility of a democratic landscape, a place where design, nature, and public life could come together for the common good. And the idea did not leave him. As he continued through England, the memory of that park remained quietly alive in his mind. He may not yet have known that one day he would help design Central Park. He may not yet have imagined the rocky, difficult ground of Manhattan becoming a vast public refuge. He may not yet have seen himself as a landscape architect at all. But something had changed. He had been given a glimpse of what a park could mean. Not a garden, not decoration, not scenery arranged for display. A park could be a civic promise. It could say to the tired worker, "You may breathe here." It could say to the child in a crowded street, "You may run here." It could say to the elderly, the lonely, the overworked, and the forgotten, you are also part of the city, and the city owes you beauty. This was the seed Birkenhead planted in him. When Olmsted later wrote about his English travels, he was not simply recording pleasant scenes. He was trying to understand the relationship between landscape and society. The same young man who had struggled to settle into one profession was beginning to discover that his restless observations had a purpose. His love of scenery, his farming experience, his sensitivity to public life, and his curiosity about social conditions were slowly joining together. The separate roads of his life were beginning to meet. The separate roads of his life were beginning to meet. The sailor who had crossed oceans understood distance. The farmer who had worked the soil understood land. The observer who had wandered through towns understood people. And now, the traveler walking through England began to understand public space. Still, the future did not arrive all at once. There was no sudden announcement, no clear moment in which he became the designer he would later be. He simply carried the idea forward, quietly, as one carries a small flame protected from the wind. He returned from England with more than memories. He returned with the belief that a beautiful landscape could improve public life, that open space could calm a city, that design could serve democracy, that the health of a society was connected in some deep and practical way to whether its people had places where they could walk freely beneath trees. Years later, when New York searched for a great public park of its own, this memory would rise again. The lakes and paths of Birkenhead would not be copied exactly, but the lesson would remain. A park must feel natural, even when carefully designed. A park must belong to everyone, not only to those who can pay for beauty. A park must offer relief from the noise of the city without fully abandoning the city itself. And so, as Olmsted moved through the damp green landscapes of England, under gray skies and along quiet paths, he was not merely traveling, he was being prepared. Prepared for Manhattan, prepared for Central Park, prepared for the idea that would define his life. That cities, however crowded and restless they became, still needed open places where the human spirit could breathe. When Frederick Law Olmsted returned from England, he carried with him a quiet but powerful belief. A public landscape, he had begun to understand, could be more than a pleasant place to walk. It could be a social instrument. It could offer relief, dignity, health, and shared beauty to people who might otherwise spend their lives surrounded by labor, smoke, noise, and walls. But before he would help design such a place in New York, before the rocks and swamps of Manhattan became his great test, Olmsted's restless life turned in another direction. He became a reporter, not the kind of reporter who simply sat behind a desk and repeated the opinions of others, but a traveler, an observer, a listener, a man willing to move through difficult places and look carefully at the structure of a society from the ground level. In the early 1850s, the New York Daily Times, the newspaper that would later become the New York Times, sent him into the American South. The assignment was not small. He was to observe the slaveholding states, their economy, their plantations, their roads, their towns, their farms, their habits of labor, and the daily realities hidden behind political arguments. So once again, Olmsted went out into the world. He traveled through the South, not as a soldier, not as a politician, and not as a preacher, but as a witness. The landscapes he entered were very different from the soft green parks of England. There were long roads under heavy skies, wide plantations stretching into the distance, pine forests, worn fields, river landings, isolated cabins, courthouse towns, and miles of country where the heat seemed to settle slowly over everything. At times, the scenery itself could be beautiful. Morning mist lay low across the fields. Rivers moved quietly through the trees. Spanish moss hung in pale, drifting curtains from old branches. The southern light had its own softness, its own wide and golden stillness. But beneath that beauty, Olmsted saw something deeply broken. He saw a society built upon forced labor. He saw how slavery shaped not only the lives of the enslaved, but the land, the roads, the farms, the towns, and even the habits of thought among the people who defended it. He observed not only cruelty, but inefficiency, not only injustice, but waste. Not only human suffering, but a social order that seemed to hold back the development of whole communities. He had gone south to observe, And what he observed changed him. In his earlier life, Olmsted had already learned to read landscapes. He could look at a field and think about soil, drainage, slope, and use. He could look at a road and notice how it guided the body. He could look at a park and understand how open space could serve ordinary people. Now, in the South, he began to read society in the same way. He looked at the plantation not only as a place of agriculture, but as a system. He noticed who worked and who profited. He noticed the condition of roads, schools, homes, markets, and public life. He saw how deeply the institution of slavery affected the everyday organization of space. A society, he began to understand, also has a landscape. Its values appear in its roads. Its inequalities appear in its houses. Its economy appears in its fields. Its moral condition appears in the way people are allowed, or not allowed, to move through the world. This was not the peaceful lesson of Birkenhead Park. It was a harder lesson, a darker one. But it belonged to the same developing mind. If England had shown him that public beauty could improve civic life, the South showed him what happened when public life was built on exclusion, domination, and fear. He traveled slowly, often uncomfortably, through places where strangers watched one another carefully, where conversation could be guarded, and where the truth of things had to be gathered piece by piece. He spoke with planters, laborers, travelers, townspeople, and enslaved people when he could. He noticed what was said openly and what was left unsaid. He noticed silence. That silence mattered. There are silences that bring peace, like the hush of trees in a public park. And there are silences that come from power, from danger, from people knowing that certain truths cannot be spoken freely. Olmsted was sensitive enough to feel the difference. His notes and letters from these journeys did not become loud speeches. They became detailed observations. He wrote as someone trying to measure reality carefully, trying to show Northern readers what the slave system actually did to land, labor, wealth, and human character. He saw roads in poor condition where commerce should have flourished. He saw farms that did not reach their full possibility. He saw towns that lacked many of the public improvements he associated with healthier communities. He saw poverty among many white Southerners, as well as the far deeper suffering of the enslaved, and he came to believe that slavery damaged nearly everything it touched. It damaged the enslaved first and most terribly by stealing labor, freedom, family security, and human dignity. But it also damaged the broader society around it, weakening industry, discouraging public improvement, narrowing education, and making civic trust difficult. For Olmsted, this was not only a moral problem, though it was certainly that. It was also a practical and social problem. How could a society build good public roads if its structure discouraged common investment? How could towns thrive if labor was degraded? How could public life become generous if the whole system depended on keeping some people permanently outside the circle of liberty? These questions did not belong to park design in any simple way, but they belonged to the deeper philosophy that would later guide his work. Olmsted was learning that places are never neutral. A road can connect, or it can divide. A field can feed, or it can exhaust. A city can crush the poor into narrow spaces, or it can offer them green air. A park can be private ornament, or it can be a public good. The South taught him that the arrangement of land and labor reveals the conscience of a society, and as he moved from plantation roads to small towns, from riverboats to rough inns, from overheard conversations to long solitary stretches of travel, he became more than a wandering young man trying to find himself. He became a social critic. He became someone who understood that design, politics, economy, health, and morality were not separate subjects. They lived together. They shaped one another. They appeared in the physical world. The crowded northern city and the plantation south seemed very different on the surface. One was dense, industrial, and growing fast. The other was rural, agricultural, and tied to older systems of power. But both raised the same question in Olmsted's mind. What kind of environment allows human beings to live with dignity? This question would follow him back to New York. It would be there when he looked at the overcrowded city. It would be there when he thought about immigrant families, workers, children, and the poor. It would be there when he imagined a park not as decoration for the wealthy, but as shared ground for all classes. because by now, Olmsted had seen too much to believe that beauty should belong only to private estates. He had seen the public park in England. He had seen the broken public life of the slaveholding South. He had seen how deeply ordinary people were shaped by the spaces available to them. And slowly, these experiences began to gather into one conviction. A healthy society needed shared places. Places where people could move freely. Places where the rich and poor might walk under the same trees. Places where the city did not ask who owned the land before offering shade. Places where the exhausted mind could recover some part of its freedom. The journey through the South was not peaceful in the way his later parks would be peaceful. It was not soothing, not easy, and not filled with gentle harmony. It exposed him to conflict, injustice, contradiction, and national tension, but it gave his future work depth. Without these journeys, Olmsted might have become only a man of scenery. With them, he became something larger, a man who understood that landscape was connected to democracy, a man who believed that public beauty could answer public suffering, a man who had walked through wounded society and come away more certain that the shape of the world around us matters. And so, when the road finally carried him back toward New York, he did not return as the same restless young farmer who had once crossed the Atlantic in search of ideas. He returned with a wider mind. He had seen England's public parks. He had seen the South's private power. He had seen beauty. He had seen injustice. He had seen what land could do when it was held for the few, and he had begun to imagine what land might do when it was opened for the many. Ahead of him, Manhattan waited. Rough, crowded, ambitious, impatient, a city growing faster than its own ability to rest. And somewhere within it, a wild and difficult stretch of ground was waiting for someone who could see not only what it was, but what it might become. By the time Frederick Law Olmsted returned to New York, Manhattan was no longer merely a city. It was becoming a force. The island was pushing northward with a restless confidence, as if stone, brick, smoke, and ambition had all begun moving together in the same direction. Streets stretched farther up the map. Buildings rose where open ground had been. Carts rattled over rough roads. Shops, factories, boarding houses, churches, docks, and crowded neighborhoods pressed themselves into the growing body of the city. New York was alive, but it was also exhausting. It was a place of opportunity, but not always of rest. The air could feel heavy. The streets could feel narrow. The pace of life seemed to quicken with every passing year. People came from across the ocean and from other parts of America carrying hope, fear, hunger, skill, memory, and the need for work. The city gathered them all, but it did not always give them space to breathe. And somewhere in the middle of that growing island, between the settled city below and the still rural edges above, there lay a long, difficult piece of ground. It was not yet Central Park. Not truly. It was not yet the peaceful refuge that millions would later enter through shaded gates. It was not yet the place of quiet lawns, slow carriage drives, curving paths, calm water, and trees arranged so naturally that they seemed to have always belonged there. Before all of that, it was rough land, a wild piece of Manhattan. There were rocky outcrops of dark Manhattan schist rising from the earth like old bones. There were uneven slopes, shallow wetlands, rough paths, muddy depressions, scattered trees, small gardens, animal pens, stone walls, and patches of ground that changed character with the weather. After rain, the low places softened into mud. In winter, the exposed stone held the cold. In the morning, mist could gather in the hollows, blurring the distance and making the land feel older and stranger than the city rising around it. It was beautiful in places, but not easy. It did not look like a finished dream. It looked like a problem. And more than that, it was not empty. This is important to remember. The land that would become Central Park had a human history before the park. People lived there. Homes stood there. Communities existed there, including Seneca Village, a settlement with many African American residents, as well as Irish and German immigrants in the wider park area. Families had built lives on parts of that ground. They had walked those paths before the visitors of the future. They had known those stones, those gardens, those small houses, those church connections, those ordinary boundaries of daily life. The making of Central Park brought beauty to millions, but it also required loss from those who were removed to make way for it. Olmsted's story, if told honestly, must hold both truths at once. The park would become a democratic landscape, a shared refuge, a gift to the future city. And yet its beginning was tied to displacement, government power, and the erasure of homes that had already stood there. History is rarely as smooth as a finished path. Often, beneath the grass, there are older roads. When Olmsted first entered this landscape, he did not enter it as the celebrated designer of Central Park. That title had not yet been earned. He came into the project first through administration and supervision, stepping into the practical, muddy, difficult work of turning a political idea into something real. He was not standing over a clean drawing table, calmly sketching a dream. He was walking through raw ground. He was seeing men at work. He was noticing drainage, stone, soil, grades, fences, costs, tools, delays, and disputes. The city had approved the idea of a great public park, but approving a park and making a park were very different things. On paper, the project could seem noble and clear. On the land itself, it was complicated, physical, and uncertain. The first laborers arrived not to plant beauty, but to prepare the ground. They built fences, they cleared brush, they drained wet places, they leveled uneven terrain, they cut into rock, they moved earth. They stood in mud and dust, in summer heat and winter damp, using ordinary tools against an extraordinary task. The work was heavy, repetitive, and often uncomfortable. Wagons moved slowly, horses strained, boots sank into softened ground, shovels struck stone, the air carried the smell of wet soil, cut roots, sweat, smoke, and the sharp mineral scent of disturbed rock. This was the hidden beginning of Central Park. Not music, not leisure, not a finished meadow, but labor. Olmsted understood labor. He had been a farmer. He knew that land does not become useful because someone imagines it beautifully. Land must be studied. It must be drained, shaped, protected, and patiently worked. A field does not become fertile by wishing. A road does not become graceful by drawing a line. A park does not become natural simply by planting trees. To create a place that would feel effortless, someone had to think about every difficulty. Where would the water go after rain? How could a visitor move through the park without feeling the city pressing too closely? How could carriage traffic pass without breaking the illusion of retreat? How could rocky, uneven land become picturesque rather than merely inconvenient? How could a park serve both beauty and public use? These questions suited Olmsted's mind. All the wandering years, all the unsettled work, all the strange preparation of his life began to matter. The farmer who had studied soil, the traveler who had walked through England, the reporter who had observed society, the man who had seen Birkenhead Park in the slave-holding South, all of them were present in him now as he walked this difficult Manhattan ground. He did not see only mud. He saw possibility. He saw that the roughness of the land might become strength. The rocks did not need to disappear entirely. Some could become part of the park's character. The irregular ground did not need to be forced into rigid symmetry. It could become wandering movement, changing views, sudden openings, shaded passages, and scenes that felt discovered rather than arranged. This was one of the quiet secrets of Olmsted's future genius. He did not want a park that shouted its design. He wanted a park that worked upon the mind almost without being noticed. A visitor should not feel controlled. A visitor should feel released. The path should bend gently before the mind grows tired. The trees should conceal the city just enough to let the imagination rest. The open meadow should arrive after a shaded passage like a long, peaceful breath. The water should catch the sky and make the crowded city feel far away, even when it stood just beyond the edges of the park. But in these early days, all of that was still hidden. The land had to be fought and listened to at the same time. On misty mornings, Olmsted could walk across the future parkside while the city was still half asleep. The ground beneath his boots was uneven. Damp grass brushed against stone. The rough outlines of work sites appeared to the gray air. A few laborers moved in the distance, their figures softened by fog. Horses stood quietly near carts. Wooden stakes marked future lines. Piles of rock and earth waited to be moved. There was something almost dreamlike about it. The city behind him was loud, impatient, and hungry for growth. The land before him was raw, wounded, and full of resistance, and between them stood the idea of a park, a place that did not yet exist but was already being asked to answer a deep public need. The people of New York wanted more than scenery, even if not all of them could yet say so. They needed distance from the pressure of streets. They needed clean air, shade, open ground, and a place where the eye could travel farther than the next wall. They needed somewhere to walk without buying anything, somewhere to rest without belonging to a private club, somewhere to feel that the city had made room for them. Olmsted had learned this lesson in England. He had seen its moral urgency in the South. Now he saw its physical challenge in Manhattan. The park would need to be democratic not only in law, but in feeling. It could not be a private garden pretending to be public. It could not serve only the wealthy, the fashionable, or the refined. It had to welcome the worker on a Sunday afternoon, the immigrant family, the tired mother, the child, the elderly, the solitary walker, the carriage rider, the daydreamer, the person with nowhere else to go. And yet, to welcome everyone, it had to be carefully ordered. Freedom, in a public park, required design. Paths had to separate different forms of movement. Drives, walks, and bridle paths could not constantly collide. The city's necessary traffic had to cross the park without destroying the experience of escape. Views had to be composed, but not made theatrical. Nature had to be shaped, but not made to look artificial. This was not decoration. It was civic architecture made of land. Still, Olmsted was not alone in what would come next. The great turning point was approaching. Calvert Vaux, the English-born architect connected to the memory of Andrew Jackson Downing, would soon invite Olmsted into a deeper partnership. Vaux had training, drawing skill, and a refined architectural eye. Olmsted had public vision, social conviction, practical experience, and a powerful feeling for what this park might mean. Together, they would prepare a plan, but before the plan, there was the ground. Before the famous name Greensward, there was mud on boots. Before the calm lake, there were drainage problems. Before the winding paths, there were stakes in rough soil. Before the illusion of nature, there was blasting, grading, hauling, cutting, filling, arguing, measuring, and waiting. This is why Central Park would never be merely a pretty place. It was born from pressure. From the pressure of a growing city, from the pressure of public need, from the pressure of politics and money, from the pressure of rock beneath the soil, from the pressure of a restless man finally finding work large enough to hold all the fragments of his life. As Olmsted looked across that wild piece of Manhattan, he could not yet know how many people would one day walk there in silence. He could not know how many tired minds would be softened by its trees, how many children would run across its lawns, how many lonely people would sit beside its water, how many generations would come to believe that this green space had always belonged to the city. But perhaps he sensed something. Perhaps standing in the gray morning air watching workers move slowly through mud and stone, he felt the same idea that had followed him from Hartford to the sea, from the farm to England, from the South back to New York. People need open space. Cities need mercy. Land, when shaped with care, can become a form of public kindness. And here, on this rough and difficult ground, that belief was about to be tested. The wild ground of Manhattan was waiting. It had stone, mud, slopes, scattered trees, difficult drainage, and the pressure of an impatient city gathering around it. It had a past that could not be erased and a future that had not yet taken form. The idea of a public park had been approved, but the question remained open and deeply uncertain. What should this place become? A grand, formal garden? A parade ground? A fashionable promenade? A collection of straight paths, fountains, monuments, and ornamental displays? Or could it become something quieter, more generous, and more deeply human? Frederick Law Olmsted had walked the ground as a superintendent, as a practical man responsible for work, order, labor, and administration. He knew its difficulties through his boots, through the mud, through the sound of tools striking stone, but he had not entered the project as a trained landscape architect. He had not spent his youth drawing formal gardens or arranging estates for wealthy patrons. He had come to this moment by a stranger road. He had been a restless child in Hartford, a young man who could not stay still, a sailor, a farmer, a traveler, a journalist. He had walked through England and seen Birkenhead Park. He had traveled through the American South and observed how land, labor, injustice, and public life were bound together. He had not followed a straight line, but perhaps that was why he could see the park differently. He did not see it only as scenery. He saw it as a social answer, a place where the crowded city might soften, a place where ordinary people could walk under trees without needing wealth, title, or permission, a place where the city might give back some of the peace it had taken from its inhabitants. But vision alone was not enough. A dream still needed shape. A belief still needed a drawing. And into this part of the story came Calvert Vaux. Vaux was very different from Olmsted in training and temperament. He was an English-born architect and designer, a man formed by drawing, structure, detail, and the visual discipline of design. He had worked with Andrew Jackson Downing, one of the influential voices who had earlier argued for the importance of parks and refined domestic landscapes in American life. Through that world, Vaux carried a deep understanding of architectural composition, how a bridge should meet a path, how a building should sit within a view, how the eye should be guided without feeling forced. Where Olmsted carried the wide social vision, Vaux carried the trained designer's hand. Where Olmsted felt the democratic purpose of the park, Vaux understood how that purpose might be given form on paper. And so, in this unlikely partnership, two different kinds of intelligence began to meet. Olmsted had the restless life behind him, the moral imagination, the social criticism, the practical knowledge of land, and the deep conviction that public beauty mattered. Vaux had the professional eye, the ability to compose, refine, draw, and turn broad feeling into visible structure. Neither man alone would have made Central Park exactly as it came to be. Together, they began to imagine something larger. The city had called for a design competition. The park needed a plan, and that plan would have to answer both the commissioners and the land itself. It would have to satisfy requirements, manage traffic, create beauty, and solve practical problems. It would have to give New York not merely a decorated space, but a living public landscape. Other designs might have treated the park as a formal object, a place to be looked at, a place of symmetry and display, a place where straight avenues, monuments, and carefully arranged features announced themselves with confidence. But Olmsted and Vaux imagined something more subtle. They imagined a park that would not immediately reveal its design. A visitor would not step inside and understand everything at once. Instead, the park would unfold slowly, like a long, quiet walk through a countryside that seemed to have been waiting there all along. Paths would bend, views would open and close, trees would conceal the city, then frame the sky. Meadows would appear after passages of shade. Water would reflect light in calm, unexpected places. The park would feel natural. But that natural feeling would be the result of intense design. This was the great paradox at the heart of the Greensward Plan. The park was not to be wild in the careless sense. It was not simply land left alone. It was to be carefully arranged so that it could give the emotional relief of nature to people living in an artificial city. Every turn mattered. Every separation mattered. Every concealed road, every bridge, every path, every open meadow, every planted edge would work together to create the feeling of release. One of the most important problems was traffic. Manhattan could not simply stop being a city because a park had been placed in its center. People still needed to cross from east to west. Commerce, carriages, and daily movement would continue. If ordinary city traffic cut straight through the park at the same level as peaceful walks, the illusion of retreat would be broken again and again. Olmsted and Vaux answered this with one of the plan's most powerful ideas. They proposed sunken transverse roads. These roads would carry crosstown traffic through the park, but below the main park landscape, allowing vehicles and necessary urban movement to pass without constantly interrupting the visitor's experience of quiet. The city would still function, but its noise and pressure would be lowered, hidden, softened beneath the designed surface of the park. It was a practical solution, but it was also poetic. The city could pass through the park without possessing it. The machinery of urban life could continue, while above it, people could walk beneath trees and feel, for a little while, that they had escaped. This was exactly the kind of problem Olmsted's mind understood. He did not want a park that denied the city. He wanted a park that healed the city, and healing required both beauty and order. Vaux, with his architectural discipline, helped give that order shape. He could see how bridges, arches, terraces, and buildings might be placed without destroying the pastoral feeling. He understood that structures inside the park should not feel like interruptions, but like quiet companions to the land. A bridge should not merely carry a person across a path, it should belong to the scene. A terrace should not simply be useful, it should hold the dignity of public life. The two men worked through the plan with intensity. One can imagine them surrounded by papers, surveys, sketches, measurements, and notes, the difficult shape of Manhattan spread before them. The land was not blank. It resisted. It had ridges, hollows, water problems, existing roads, and hard stone. But the difficulty of the site became part of the design's strength. They did not try to erase the landscape entirely. They tried to transform it. Rock could become character. Irregular ground could become variety. A hollow could become water. A slope could become a revealing view. A difficult crossing could become a bridge. The very roughness that had made the land seem unsuitable could, with patience and imagination, become the reason the park felt alive. The name they gave their proposal was the Greensward Plan. The word itself carried a softness, an image of green turf, open ground, grass under light, a surface of rest. But beneath that gentle name was an ambitious civic vision. The plan was not merely about making land beautiful. It was about making beauty public. It was about giving a crowded city a shared landscape where class, work, and daily pressure might briefly loosen their grip. In Olmsted's mind, this mattered profoundly. He had seen private landscapes in England. He had seen public parks open their gates to ordinary people. He had seen, in the South, how deeply a society could be damaged when human dignity was denied and public life was narrowed. Now, in New York, he was helping shape a place that would stand for a different principle. A place where no single family owned the view. A place where the worker and the wealthy could pass through the same meadow light. A place where the city, for once, would not ask people to buy rest. The plan moved through the competition not as the most ornate proposal and not as the most immediately spectacular. Its power was quieter. It trusted the long experience of walking. It trusted grass, water, trees, distance, and carefully composed transitions. It did not try to dominate the visitor with grand gestures at every turn. It created a world in which the visitor could feel gently guided, but never trapped. That was part of its genius. A formal garden often announces the mind of the designer. The Greensward Plan tried to quiet the designer's hand. It wanted the person walking through the park to feel not, "Someone has arranged this for me," but rather, "I have found my way into calm." And in 1858, the commissioners chose it. The plan by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux was selected as the winning design for Central Park. It was a decisive moment, but not a loud one. There was no sudden transformation of Manhattan overnight. The rocks did not soften at once. The mud did not disappear. The trees did not rise fully grown from the soil. The city did not suddenly become quiet. But something important had happened. A vision had been accepted. The wild ground now had a direction. Olmsted, the restless man who had tried so many lives, had found a task large enough to gather them all. His farming, his travel, his journalism, his social criticism, his love of scenery, his belief in public access, his patience with land, all of it now had a place to go. And Vaux, the skilled architect and designer, had found in Olmsted a partner whose public purpose gave moral depth to design. Together, they had drawn not merely a park, but an argument in green. An argument that beauty could belong to everyone. An argument that cities should not be built only for movement, trade, and profit. An argument that rest was a civic need. An argument that a designed landscape could make people feel freer, calmer, and more human. Yet winning the competition was only the beginning. A drawing, however beautiful, is still only a promise. The Greensward Plan now had to become earth, water, path, bridge, meadow, and shade. It had to survive budgets, politics, engineering problems, competing opinions, and the sheer stubbornness of Manhattan rock. It had to be built by hands, by horses, by carts, by blasting, by planting, by drainage, by years of labor and argument. Olmsted and Vaux had dreamed the park in green. Now the dream would have to be carved into the ground, and as the city continued to grow around them, louder and more crowded with every passing season, The two men stood at the edge of a long and difficult work. Before them lay a park that existed only in fragments. Behind them stood the city that needed it, and between the two was the quiet, demanding labor of turning a public dream into a living place. The Greensward Plan had been chosen. On paper, it was graceful. On paper, the park seemed almost inevitable. A long sweep of green in the center of Manhattan with open meadows, quiet water, winding paths, hidden roads, bridges, trees, and spaces where the crowded city could finally loosen its grip on the human spirit. But paper is silent. Land is not. The land resisted. The dream that Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux had drawn in green now had to become soil, stone, water, path, meadow, and shade. It had to leave the quiet world of lines and measurements and enter the real world of mud, politics, labor, money, weather, and rock. Central Park did not rise gently from the earth like a natural forest waking from sleep. It was made, slowly, heavily, with thousands of hands, with carts, shovels, horses, drills, blasting powder, drainage pipes, cut stone, imported soil, and years of patient correction. This is one of the great quiet truths of Central Park. The place that would one day feel so natural was, from the beginning, an enormous act of design. The visitor of the future would walk beneath trees and feel that the park had always been there. They would cross a bridge and feel it belonged naturally to the curve of the path. They would stand beside water and believe that the lake had simply gathered in a hollow of the land. They would look across a meadow and feel the effortless calm of open space. But behind that feeling of effortlessness was effort everywhere. The rocks had to be cut, the hollows had to be drained, the wet places had to be controlled, the soil had to be improved, the paths had to be placed with care, the views had to be composed, the roads had to be hidden, and the whole landscape had to be shaped so carefully that the shaping itself would disappear. Olmsted understood this paradox deeply. The park must look free, but it could not be careless. It must feel natural, but it could not be accidental. It must give relief from the city, but it had to function inside the city. This was the work now before him and Vaux, not only to create beauty, but to create the conditions in which beauty could quietly do its work. Around them, New York did not pause. The city continued to move, build, argue, sell, buy, expand, and demand. Political pressures gathered. Budgets tightened. Commissioners debated. Contractors, laborers, engineers, critics, and city officials all had their own expectations. Some wanted speed. Some wanted economy. Some wanted visible grandeur. Some wanted practical routes. Some wanted the park to prove itself immediately. But landscapes do not mature immediately. A tree does not become shade the day it is planted. A meadow does not become peaceful the moment the soil is graded. A lake does not become calm until water, edge, reflection, and surrounding view have all found their balance. Olmsted and Vaux were trying to build something whose full value would only be understood with time. That made the work difficult. The city wanted results. The land required patience. Day after day, the park became a world of labor. In the gray light of early morning, men arrived with tools over their shoulders and mud already waiting beneath their boots. Horses stood in damp air, harnesses creaking softly as carts were loaded and moved. Stones were lifted, dragged, broken, or set aside. Earth was cut from one place and carried to another. Drainage lines were laid beneath the surface, invisible but essential, because a park that could not handle water could not survive. Rain changed everything. A path that had seemed firm one day could soften by morning. A low place could fill and hold water. A slope could reveal a problem not visible on the drawing. The land kept answering back, and the designers had to listen. This was not the kind of design that ended when the plan was approved. It continued in the field. It continued with every adjustment, with every grade corrected, with every curve reconsidered, with every decision about what to conceal, what to reveal, what to soften, and what to leave strong. Some of the original rock remained, not as failure, but as character. The stone that made the work so difficult also gave the park its identity. It grounded the landscape. It reminded visitors, even unconsciously, that this green refuge belonged to Manhattan and could not have been lifted from anywhere else. Other parts of the land had to be transformed almost completely. Poor soil could not simply be wished into fertility. Plants needed ground that would hold them, feed them, and allow their roots to settle. Water had to be directed. Meadows had to be prepared. Trees had to be chosen and placed not merely as decoration, but as part of a long future. A young tree was not only a young tree, it was a promise of future shade. A path was not only a path, it was a way of shaping the visitor's state of mind. A bridge was not only a crossing, it was a moment of transition. Olmsted and Vaux had to think not only about what the park would look like from a distance, but how it would feel step by step. The visitor would enter from the city with the sound of wheels, voices, trade, and construction still in the ears. The park had to receive that person gently. It had to slow the body before the mind realized it was slowing. It had to replace the hard lines of streets with curves. It had to exchange straight pressure for wandering movement. A person should not feel commanded to rest. They should simply begin to rest. That required hidden discipline. Carriage drives, walking paths, and bridle paths had to move through the landscape without constantly colliding. The transverse roads had to carry city traffic across the park while remaining lowered and separated, so the experience above could remain calm. The park was not an escape because the city disappeared completely. It was an escape because the design knew how to lower the city's presence. This idea was both practical and emotional. The city was still there. But for the walker beneath the trees, it became distant, muted, almost dreamlike. Here again, the park's peace was not accidental. It was engineered. The silence was designed. The feeling of being away was constructed. The naturalness was planned. And that is why the work demanded so much from everyone involved. Olmsted had to be more than a dreamer. Vaux had to be more than an artist. They had to deal with committees, accounts, construction realities, criticism, and compromise. They had to protect the deeper purpose of the park while answering the daily problems of building it. There were days when the project must have felt less like poetry and more like administration. Lists, costs, arguments, schedules, complaints, instructions, revisions. But even this belonged to the making of peace. A public park is not created only in moments of inspiration. It is created through the patient endurance of practical difficulty. It is created when someone continues to defend a quiet vision while the noisy world asks for easier answers. Olmsted knew noise. He had heard it in cities. He had heard it in politics. He had heard it in the debates of a divided nation. He had heard it in the restless uncertainty of his own youth. And perhaps that is why he understood so clearly that peace was not weakness. Peace had to be built. It had to be protected. It had to be given form strong enough to survive the pressures around it. As the months passed, pieces of the park slowly began to emerge. A curve of path here, a prepared meadow there, a body of water taking shape where workmen had controlled the movement of drainage and flow, a bridge beginning to define the meeting of two routes, a planted edge softening what had once been raw. To the eye of a casual passerby, the place may still have seemed unfinished, muddy, and confused. But to Olmsted and Vaux, the hidden order was beginning to appear. The park was gradually learning how to breathe. Still, the work carried tension. Every public project belongs partly to the public, and therefore partly to argument. Some people question the cost. Others question the choices. Some could not yet understand why so much care should be spent arranging ground, trees, water, and paths. To them, perhaps, a park was simply a park. Grass, trees, and room enough to walk. But Olmsted knew that a truly public landscape was never that simple. If it was badly designed, it could become empty, uncomfortable, unsafe, or quickly ruined. If it was too formal, it could feel like property rather than refuge. If it was too wild, it could fail to serve the many different people who needed to use it. If it was too open, it could feel exposed. If it was too enclosed, it could feel oppressive. A park had to balance freedom and guidance, solitude and society, movement and rest, nature and city. This balance was the invisible architecture of Central Park. The benches, paths, bridges, meadows, water, trees, and roads were only the visible parts. Beneath them was a deeper intention to create a democratic experience of calm. Not a private garden, not an aristocratic estate, not a decorative luxury, a civic refuge. A place where, for a little while, New York's noise could be softened into distance. And as the work continued, the future park began to hold more and more of Olmsted's life within it. The child from Hartford who had learned to see slowly. The young man who had gone to sea and returned unsatisfied. The farmer who had learned patience from soil. The traveler who had seen Birkenhead Park. The reporter who had walked through the South and studied the moral shape of society. The superintendent who had stepped onto the rough Manhattan ground and understood that beauty would have to be worked into existence. All of them were present in this labor. All of them had been necessary. The park was teaching him as much as he was shaping it. It taught him that the greatest landscapes are not made by force alone. They are made by force guided into gentleness, rock cut into passage, water controlled into calm, soil moved into meadow, roads hidden into silence, labor transformed into rest. This was the quiet miracle taking shape in the middle of Manhattan. A place made from noise, designed to produce quiet. A place born from mud, intended to feel clean and open. A place built with effort, meant to feel effortless. A place engineered so deeply that one day tired people would walk through it and simply feel that nature had welcomed them. And that perhaps was the true genius of the work. Not that Olmsted and Vaux brought nature into the city as untouched wilderness, but that they created the experience of nature where the city needed it most. They built peace in the middle of noise, and as Central Park slowly emerged from stone, mud, labor, and argument, it began to prove the belief that had been growing in Olmsted for years, that public beauty was not a luxury. It was a form of care, and in a city growing louder by the day, care had to be built strong enough to last. While Central Park was slowly taking shape in the middle of Manhattan, the nation around it was beginning to break apart. The same country that needed parks, public health, shared beauty, and common ground was now moving toward war. Arguments that had lived for decades in newspapers, speeches, churches, legislatures, and private conversations finally hardened into something far more terrible. The question of slavery, union, power, and freedom could no longer be held at a distance. In 1861, the American Civil War began, and once again, Frederick Law Olmsted's life turned sharply away from the path that seemed to be forming beneath his feet. Central Park had given him work large enough for his restless mind. It had gathered his farming, his travel, his journalism, his social conscience, his love of scenery, and his belief in public life into one vast civic task. He had helped dream a place where exhausted people might walk in peace. But now the country was filled with another kind of exhaustion. Not the tiredness of crowded streets, not the quiet fatigue of workers needing shade and open air, but the brutal exhaustion of armies, disease, wounds, fear, confusion, and death. Olmsted did not enter this war as a general. He did not command troops in battle. He did not become famous for leading charges or standing beneath flags on a smoky field. His work was quieter, more administrative, and in many ways more suited to the deeper pattern of his life. He moved toward the wounded. He moved toward organization. He moved toward the question of how a suffering society might be cared for when its existing systems were failing. He took leave from Central Park and joined the newly formed United States Sanitary Commission, a civilian relief organization created to support the health and welfare of Union soldiers. The work was immense. The Union Army was growing quickly, but growth did not mean readiness. Volunteers arrived with courage, but often without proper supplies, training, medical systems, or sanitary conditions. Camps could become crowded and unhealthy. Disease moved through men faster than many people expected. Wounds from battle were only one part of the suffering. Fever, infection, exhaustion, poor food, bad water, and disorganization all became enemies of the soldiers. Olmsted had spent years thinking about how environment shapes human life. Now that lesson appeared in its most urgent form. A badly drained camp could become a place of sickness. A poorly supplied hospital could become a place of despair. A confused transport system could leave wounded men waiting too long. A missing blanket, a shortage of bandages, a lack of clean water, or a delayed order could mean pain, infection, or death. The details mattered. They had always mattered. In Central Park, drainage mattered because water had to move quietly beneath the surface to keep the landscape alive. In wartime, sanitation mattered because men's lives depended on it. In the park, Olmsted had hidden roads below the surface so peace could exist above them. In the war, he tried to build hidden systems of care beneath the visible drama of battle, systems of inspection, supply, transport, nursing, and relief. The work was not beautiful in the way a meadow was beautiful. It was not quiet in the way a shaded path was quiet. It was crowded, urgent, grim, and exhausting. Yet beneath it was the same moral idea. Public care mattered. Human beings should not be abandoned to disorder. A society had a responsibility to protect the vulnerable, whether they were workers in a crowded city, families needing open air, or soldiers lying sick and wounded far from home. Olmsted threw himself into the work with intense energy. He helped organize inspections of army camps. He supported the collection and distribution of supplies. He worked with doctors, nurses, volunteers, government officials, and military authorities. He dealt with reports, letters, requests, complaints, and emergencies. He pushed for better systems where there had been confusion. He tried to bring order to a war that constantly produced more suffering than any office could easily manage. There were days when the work must have felt endless. A letter would arrive. A hospital needed supplies. A camp needed inspection. A transport had to be arranged. A new battle had created new numbers of wounded. A group of volunteers needed direction. A shipment had to be sent. A government official had to be persuaded. Another report had to be written. Another problem had to be solved before morning. This was not the calm labor of designing a path through trees. This was care under pressure. And still, in a strange way, the same Olmsted remained. The man who noticed the condition of roads in the South now noticed the condition of army camps. The man who had studied the social meaning of public parks now studied the social meaning of public health. The man who believed that cities needed places of relief now believed that armies needed systems of relief. He had always been concerned with the spaces where people lived, moved, suffered, and recovered. The war simply made the need more urgent. During the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia, the work of the Sanitary Commission became especially intense. Sick and wounded men needed to be moved, treated, supplied, and cared for on a scale that would have overwhelmed smaller habits of organization. Hospital boats and transport systems became part of the effort to carry men away from the front and toward care. Rivers, docks, and ships became temporary extensions of the medical system. Olmsted moved through this world not as an artist of scenery, but as an organizer of mercy. The images around him were very different from Central Park. No quiet lake catching the sky. No meadow opening after a shaded path. No city softened into distance by trees. Instead, there were crowded boats, rough landings, temporary hospitals, tired nurses, anxious doctors, boxes of supplies, rows of cots, the smell of sickness, and the low human sounds of pain and waiting. And yet even here, he looked for order. He looked for flow. He looked for ways to move people from danger toward relief. He looked for systems that could reduce suffering, even if they could not end it. This part of his life was deeply important because it tested the strength of his belief in public service. It is easy to believe in public beauty when one is walking through a park. It is harder to believe in public care when the world is filled with blood, disease, politics, and exhaustion. But Olmsted did believe. He believed enough to work past comfort. He believed enough to strain his body and mind. He believed enough to become almost consumed by the responsibility. The same quality that made him powerful also made him vulnerable. He wanted systems to work. He wanted suffering to be answered. He wanted details controlled because details mattered. But war creates more details than any one person can hold. Slowly, the pressure wore him down. The work demanded constant attention. The needs were too many. The failures of the Army medical system were too large. The politics around the commission were difficult. The emotional burden of wounded men, sick camps, and national crisis pressed heavily upon him. The man who had tried to build peace in the middle of noise now found himself surrounded by a noise that could not be softened by trees. There was no park large enough to quiet the Civil War. There was only work, and more need. In this way, the war became a dark mirror of his earlier life. It showed him again that human beings are shaped by their environments, by clean air or foul air, by order or confusion, by care or neglect, by the presence or absence of public responsibility. But it also showed him the cost of carrying too much. Olmsted had always been restless. He had moved from trade to the sea, from the sea to farming, from farming to travel, from travel to journalism, from journalism to Central Park, from Central Park to war relief. Each road had added something to him. Each road had prepared him. But now, for the first time, the work did not simply shape him, it drained him. The exhaustion was not only physical, it was moral. It was the exhaustion of seeing too much need and never enough time. It was the exhaustion of believing that order could save lives while knowing that disorder would return again tomorrow. It was the exhaustion of trying to serve a wounded nation with papers, ships, supplies, inspections, and human will. And yet, even this difficult chapter belonged to the larger story of his life. Olmsted had not left Central Park because the park no longer mattered. He had left because the same principle had called him elsewhere. Public life needed care. Sometimes that care looked like a meadow. Sometimes it looked like clean water. Sometimes it looked like a road hidden beneath a park. Sometimes it looked like a hospital ship moving through dark water with wounded men aboard. The form changed. The purpose remained: to reduce suffering, to create order where disorder harmed the vulnerable, to give tired bodies and minds a chance to recover. When Olmsted finally moved beyond this wartime work, he would not return to landscape design as the same man. The war had shown him the fragility of bodies, the importance of systems, and the terrible cost of neglect. It had deepened his understanding of public health and public responsibility. Central Park had been a refuge from the pressures of the city. The Sanitary Commission had been a response to the wounds of the nation. Both were part of the same quiet conviction that civilization is measured not only by what it builds, but by how carefully it cares. And so, after the mud, the hospitals, the letters, the boats, the wounded men, and the long days of exhaustion, Olmsted carried forward a heavier wisdom. The designer of peaceful landscapes had passed through war. He had seen the body of the country wounded, and he would spend the rest of his life, in one way or another, still trying to heal it with open ground, moving air, shade, order, and places of rest. After the war, Frederick Law Olmsted returned to landscape work with a heavier understanding of what public life required. Central Park had taught him that a city needed relief. The Civil War had taught him that a nation needed care. And between those two lessons, something in his mind had become clearer. A park was not simply a pleasant place set aside for leisure. It was part of a much larger question. How should people live together? How should a city make room for health? How should movement, rest, work, and home be arranged? How could crowded streets be connected to open air? How could beauty be made useful, and usefulness be made beautiful? Olmsted had begun with one wild piece of Manhattan, but the idea could not remain there. Central Park was too large in meaning to become only a New York story. Once the principle had taken root, it began to spread outward, quietly and steadily, like green branches reaching beyond the trunk of a tree. Soon, Brooklyn called. Across the East River, Brooklyn was growing quickly, developing its own identity, its own neighborhoods, its own pressures, and its own need for open space. It was not yet part of New York City, but it was already becoming one of the great urban places of America. Families moved through its streets. Workers returned home from long days. Churches, shops, houses, and roads spread across the land, and like Manhattan, Brooklyn needed more than buildings. It needed a breathing place. Prospect Park became the answer. Again, Olmsted worked with Calvert Vaux, the partner whose trained architectural eye had helped shape Central Park's dream into visible order. But Prospect Park was not simply a repetition of what they had already done. It was another chance to refine the idea. Central Park had been long, narrow, difficult, and bound tightly by the rigid grid of Manhattan. Prospect Park offered different possibilities. Its land could be shaped into broader scenes, deeper pastoral spaces, and a feeling of more complete retreat. Olmsted and Vaux could think again about meadows, water, woods, paths, drives, and the gentle movement of people through a landscape that seemed, at its best, to soften the city around it. They imagined Prospect Park not as a decorative object, but as a world of experience. A person might enter from the noise of Brooklyn and slowly feel the city fall away. The paths would not rush forward in hard, straight lines. The land would offer sequence, contrast, and release. Open meadows would give the eye distance. Wooded areas would create shelter. Water would gather quiet light. Roads and walks would guide movement while allowing the mind to feel free. This was Olmsted's mature language becoming more confident. He was learning how to design not only a park, but a change in human feeling. The visitor would arrive carrying the city inside the body. The pressure of work, the weight of rooms, the noise of wheels, the closeness of streets. And the park would answer slowly, not with a command, but with atmosphere. The body would relax before the mind could explain why. The pace of walking would change. The breath would deepen. The eye would travel farther. Thought would become less crowded. This was the quiet purpose behind the beauty. But Olmsted and Vaux were beginning to think beyond the park boundary itself. A single park could offer relief, yes, but what if the journey to the park also mattered? What if the streets leading toward open space could become part of the experience? What if a city's green places could be connected rather than isolated? From this thinking came the importance of parkways. A parkway was not merely a road. It was not just a practical line of transportation. In Olmsted's hands, it became a kind of extended landscape, a green movement corridor, a way of carrying some of the park's spirit outward into the city. Eastern Parkway and Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn helped express this larger idea that streets themselves could be softened, widened, planted, and shaped to serve both movement and public well-being. A park was no longer a single destination. It was becoming part of a system. This was the idea that would define much of Olmsted's later work. He was not simply placing patches of green inside cities. He was thinking about how cities themselves should be organized around access to air, shade, scenery, and movement. He was beginning to design the relationship between urban life and natural relief, and this thinking grew even more ambitious in Buffalo. Buffalo, located far to the west of New York City, was expanding into an important American city, connected to trade, water, industry, and movement. It did not need only one park placed like an ornament in the middle of growth. It needed a whole structure of public landscapes, large parks, smaller spaces, and connecting parkways that could organize the city's future. For Buffalo, Olmsted and Vaux developed a park system. That word matters. System, not simply a park, not simply a garden, not simply a place of Sunday walking. A system meant relationship. It meant that one green space could speak to another. It meant that parkways could connect distant districts. It meant that public landscapes could guide city growth rather than merely decorate it after the fact. In Buffalo, the idea expanded from refuge to planning. Large parks could give broad relief. Parkways could create beautiful movement. Smaller green spaces could offer rest closer to daily life. Together, they could shape how people moved through the city, how neighborhoods related to each other, and how urban growth might remain humane. This was Olmsted becoming more than the man of Central Park. He was becoming a designer of urban life. The same principle appeared in another form at Riverside, Illinois. There, west of Chicago, Olmsted and Vaux helped plan a suburban community shaped not by the rigid grid alone, but by curving streets, open green spaces, and sensitivity to the natural contours of the land. Riverside was not a park in the ordinary sense. It was a place where people would live. Homes, roads, trees, and common spaces were meant to belong together. The idea was quiet but powerful. Daily life itself could be landscaped. A person should not have to leave all beauty behind when returning home. The road to a house could curve with the land. A neighborhood could feel more like a settled landscape than a collection of lots. Green space could be woven through ordinary domestic life, not reserved only for special excursions. In Riverside, the park idea entered the pattern of residence. In Buffalo, it entered the structure of a whole city. In Brooklyn, it moved outward through parkways. And through all these projects, Olmsted's central belief remained steady. People needed contact with scenery, not as luxury, not as decoration, not as something reserved for estates or occasional holidays. They needed it as part of a healthy life. The restless child from Hartford, the uncertain young sailor, the patient farmer, the English traveler, the Southern reporter, the Central Park superintendent, the wartime organizer, all of them had become one man now. His many lives were no longer scattered. They had gathered into a single vocation. He was shaping places where people could recover. Sometimes that meant a meadow, sometimes a parkway, sometimes a lake, sometimes a shaded neighborhood road, sometimes a connected system of parks stretching across a city. He had come to understand that landscape could do more than please the eye. It could influence habits, soften divisions, encourage movement, protect health, and give dignity to ordinary public life. A city, in Olmsted's imagination, was not complete when it had only streets, buildings, factories, houses, and markets. A city needed pauses. It needed green corridors. It needed public rooms under the sky. It needed places where people could walk without hurry, breathe without effort, and remember that they were part of something larger than labor and traffic. And so after Central Park, his work did not become smaller, it became wider. Prospect Park carried the dream into Brooklyn. The parkways carried it through movement. Buffalo transformed it into a city-wide system. Riverside carried it into the shape of home and neighborhood. Piece by piece, Olmsted was no longer designing only parks. He was designing a way for modern life to remain human. As the years moved on, Frederick Law Olmsted's work spread farther and farther beyond the first green refuge of Central Park. By now, he was no longer simply the man who had helped shape one famous park in New York. He had become something broader, quieter, and more lasting. A designer of public landscapes, a defender of scenery, and a planner of places where modern life could remain connected to air, water, trees, and rest. His dream was growing larger. It moved first toward one of the most powerful natural scenes in North America, Niagara Falls. Niagara was not a city park. It was not a meadow shaped from urban rock, nor a neighborhood landscape designed for Sunday walks. It was something older, wilder, and far more overwhelming. A vast natural force where water fell with a sound so deep it seemed to rise from the earth itself. But even Niagara was not safe from the pressures of commerce. By the 19th century, parts of the area around the falls had become crowded with private claims, commercial structures, viewing fees, signs, and attractions that threatened to turn wonder into business. A place that should have belonged, in spirit, to everyone was being broken into fragments of ownership and profit. Olmsted understood the danger. He had spent his life arguing, in one form or another, that certain kinds of beauty should not be locked away. Central Park had expressed that idea inside a crowded city. Niagara expressed it on a grander natural scale. Some landscapes, he believed, carried a public meaning too deep to be treated as ordinary property. They should be protected. They should be approached with respect. They should be made accessible, not exploited. To stand before falling water, to feel mist on the face, to hear the endless thunder of the river, to watch sunlight break across the moving spray. These were not luxuries meant only for those who could pay. They were encounters with nature that could enlarge the mind and quiet the soul. At Niagara, Olmsted's work pointed toward preservation. The goal was not to decorate the falls. The goal was to remove what distracted from them, to let the scenery speak again, to give people paths, viewpoints, and access, while allowing the power of the natural landscape to remain the central experience. It was a different kind of design, not the creation of beauty from difficult ground, but the protection of beauty from human impatience. And this idea would echo far beyond Niagara. In Boston, Olmsted faced another kind of challenge. There, the problem was not a single park or a single natural wonder, but an entire urban region shaped by water, marshland, neighborhoods, roads, and public health concerns. Boston needed more than one green space. It needed connection. It needed drainage, movement, air, and beauty to work together. From this need came the great vision of the emerald necklace. The name itself feels gentle, almost ornamental, but the idea behind it was practical and powerful. A necklace is not one jewel. It is a connected chain. Each part gains meaning from the others. In the same way, Olmsted imagined Boston's green spaces not as isolated parks, but as a linked system: waterways, parkways, ponds, paths, meadows, and wooded places forming a continuous public landscape. It was one of the clearest expressions of his mature genius. The emerald necklace was beautiful, but it was not only beautiful. It helped manage water, it shaped movement, it connected neighborhoods, it gave the city lungs. It turned difficult, marshy, and fragmented land into a long sequence of public experience. A person could move through one landscape into another, from formal city spaces toward wilder and broader scenery. Gradually leaving behind the pressure of streets, the system did not merely offer a park to visit, it offered a way for the city to breathe through itself. Here, Olmsted's early lessons all returned. The farmer who understood land and drainage, the traveler who had seen public parks in England, the reporter who had studied society and inequality, the designer who had learned in Central Park that peace must be carefully engineered. All of those lives were present in Boston's Green Chain. Then, late in his career, came Biltmore. In the mountains of North Carolina, George Vanderbilt planned an enormous estate, and Olmsted was asked to shape the surrounding grounds. The scale was very different from a city park. Here there would be a great house, formal approaches, gardens, forests, roads, fields, and long views into a mountainous landscape. But Olmsted did not see even this private estate as mere ornament. He thought in systems. He thought in futures. He thought about how land should be restored, planted, managed, and allowed to endure. At Biltmore, the landscape was not simply arranged for display around a mansion. It became part of a larger experiment in stewardship, formal gardens near the house, broader natural scenery beyond, and managed forest across wider land. Once again, the same principle appeared in a new form. Beauty was not enough. A landscape had to live well, it had to function, it had to mature, it had to belong to time. And as these projects multiplied, Niagara, Boston, Biltmore, campuses, neighborhoods, parkways, and public grounds, Olmsted's work required a more permanent home. That home was Fairsted, in Brookline, Massachusetts. There, beginning in the 1880s, his residence and office became the center of a professional practice unlike anything America had really seen before. Drawings, plans, reports, plant lists, surveys, letters, and models gathered there. Younger designers learned there. His sons and successors would carry the work forward from there. Fairsted was not only a house, it was the workshop of an emerging profession. The restless young man from Hartford, who had once failed to follow a simple path, had helped create a path for others. Landscape architecture was becoming not just an instinct, not just gardening, not just estate improvement, but a disciplined public art, a profession capable of shaping cities, campuses, parks, neighborhoods, forests, and national scenery. This was the larger dream. Not one park, not one city, not one famous green space. A whole way of thinking about land and human life. By the time Olmsted's career began to slow, the idea that had followed him since youth had taken root across America, that people need open air, shared beauty, thoughtful movement, and places where the pressures of modern life can soften. At Niagara, he helped defend wonder. In Boston, he helped connect a city through green space. At Biltmore, he helped shape land for beauty and stewardship. At Fairsted, he helped turn a lifetime of restless observation into a profession that would outlive him, and quietly, beneath all of it, the same belief remained. Land is never only land. It is memory. It is health. It is public life. It is refuge, and when shaped with patience, humility, and care, it can help a tired world remember how to breathe. In the end, Frederick Law Olmsted's life did not look like a life of a man who had followed one straight road. It looked like a landscape. There were turns, delays, open fields, difficult crossings, shaded paths, hard stone, deep valleys, and unexpected views. He had been a child with uncertain eyes, a young man without a fixed profession, a sailor, a farmer, a traveler, a reporter, a public servant, a designer, and finally, the quiet founder of a way of thinking that would continue long after his own footsteps had faded. He did not simply design parks. He designed places where tired people could feel human again. He understood that a city is not only made of buildings, streets, trade, and ambition. It is also made of breath. It is made of pauses. It is made of the small relief a person feels when a path curves away from noise, when trees soften the edge of the sky, when water holds the light, when open grass allows the mind to loosen its grip on the day. Central Park was not only a park. Prospect Park was not only a park. The Emerald Necklace was not only a chain of green spaces. Niagara was not only scenery to be protected. Fairsted was not only a home and office. Together, they were parts of one long belief that land, shaped with patience and public purpose, could care for people. Olmsted's work did not remove suffering from the world. No park could end poverty, war, loneliness, illness, or exhaustion. But his landscapes offered something gentler and still deeply necessary. They offered room to walk, room to breathe, room to be quiet, room to feel, for a little while, that the world was larger and kinder than the crowded places where people spent their days. And perhaps that is why his legacy remains so calm and enduring. Because even now, long after his lifetime, people still enter those green spaces carrying the weight of ordinary life. They come tired, they come hurried, they come distracted, lonely, restless, or overwhelmed, and without needing to know his name, they follow the paths he imagined. They sit beneath trees planted by an old vision of public care. They look across meadows, ponds, bridges, and shaded walks, and something inside them slowly begins to soften. The restless mind of Frederick Law Olmsted found its peace by creating peace for others. And as night settles over the city, as the lamps glow softly beyond the trees, as the paths grow quiet and the water darkens beneath the sky, his work seems to whisper the same gentle truth again and again. People need beauty. People need space. People need places where the noise of the world can fall away, and in those quiet places, if only for a moment, they can remember how to breathe.